Hi everyone, I'm Smita. I'm doing my PhD in IIT Ropar, India. I'll be talking on evading tipping points in socio-mutualistic networks via structure-mediated optimal strategy. First of all, I would like to thank British Ecological Society for giving me this opportunity to present before you all my work with my supervisor and my colleague. I thank them. With this, I start. So as you see here in the picture are three examples of mutualism in nature. I'd be talking about the example on the right, which involves a plant and a pollinator. Plants and pollinators exhibit mutualism, where plants provide the pollinator with nectar and the pollinator helps the plants in reproduction. Plants and pollinators, they are found in nature and everywhere, and why are we talking about them is because they are very important. They provide us with such ecosystem services, and the food that we eat indirectly or directly is a gift from the pollinators. Now, plants and pollinators, they interact, and a plant can be pollinated by more than one pollinators, and a pollinator can receive nectar from more than one plants, which and thereby plants and pollinators constitute high dimensional networks. They can be represented by a particular form of network, a bipartite network. I'll explain it in the next slide. Now, on the left, you can see a figure where you see that plants and pollinators interaction on the left bottom and how certain human activities are affecting plant-pollinator interactions. So here are a few examples like human activities like use of pesticides, and which is further leading to loss of habitat, and climate change, and which is again affecting plants and pollinators, which in turn affects us. So human feedback is an important aspect which is less considered in the in respect to plant pollinators. And also, why are we at all thinking about it is because plant pollinator networks have been found to undergo critical transition or extinction as the environment deteriorates. These are some references that you can see to read more about these facts. And since plant pollinator networks are this much important to us, we will thereby try to prevent a plant pollinator extinction or a critical transition. Hereby, with this aim, we have developed the socio-mutualistic network, or we have reformulated the existing plant pollinator network, incorporating the human feedback. Now, what is this human aspect? We introduce a third state variable here, which takes care of the conservation aspect. So this xj variable denotes the conservation opinion, or the abundance or density of a population which is cooperating in the conservation opinion. As you can first see from this schematic here is a bipartite network, where on the left you have one partite, which are plants, and in the middle you have this pollinators. Now, bipartite means they have interaction between the partites, but not within the partites. And now we introduce a third aspect, the human, and this human aspect is aimed at conserving pollinators, which in turn will also conserve the entire network. So the human node is being applied on the pollinator node to conserve the pollinators and all conserve the entire plant pollinator network. So this xj variable is the conservation opinion, which is modulated by the learning rate sigma j, and is also modulated by the number of non-conservationists, or the density of non-conservationists, which is given by 1 minus xj, multiplied by the utility that the conservationists are getting from the overall interaction, from their conservation, from the non-conservationist cost, and sum total of the entire thing, which is given by the strength of the norm multiplied by the difference between a conservationist and non-conservationist density, and the rarity parameter minus the cost. The rarity parameter 1 by Aj plus C, this is to incorporate the factor that when there is enough abundance of pollinators, human will not have much reason for conserving such pollinators, and as the density goes down of the pollinators, the human will be more interested in conserving, because it will in turn affect them. So this is the socio-mutualistic plant pollinator network, whose dynamics we'll study, and further we'll see how we can prevent a community collapse using this. For this, we take into consideration some aspects of mutualistic networks or some characteristic properties that they exhibit. Here are nestedness and modularity. As you can see from the figure, nestedness implies some asymmetry in the interactions, or whereby this such an interaction which is much more nested can be represented by an upper triangular matrix, whereas modularity shows that modularity is the characteristic property whereby species tend to interact more between smaller groups, and you will therefore get small blocks within your interaction matrix. These are the formulas for nestedness and modularity, which we'll take into account. And connectance is very simple, which is the ratio of the realized interactions by all possible interactions. Now, using these structural properties, we will further see how the structural properties will also take part in the critical transition. As we are interested in studying how to prevent critical transition, there are certain other factors which will be important. So we want to keep the dimension and the connectance fixed and see how these properties, which have been previously associated with delayed or early critical transition in mutualistic networks, how they impact our socio-mutualistic network model. So with this in mind, we have constructed these structural networks with different NODFs following this algorithm in the given reference. Now, for these 4 networks that we have constructed, we'll further see how the system dynamics are looking. Further, I want to say that by now you know that we are trying to prevent a community collapse by taking a third human opinion into account at all the pollinator nodes. Now, when you apply an human conservation opinion at the pollinator nodes, it might be costly because you have large number of pollinators, a higher dimensional system extending as large as 1,000 in some instances, and some real instances. So it would be quite rational to find a way by which you can minimize the number of pollinator nodes at which you need to apply a norm to prevent a community collapse. So we have used these network structural properties to design an algorithm that will help us to minimize the number of nodes. We have for this used the modularity aspect of mutualistic networks, and what we do is that we follow the steps of this algorithm, starting from calculating modularity and the number of modules in a mutualistic network, and applying norm starting at the generalist species of each of these modules, and with the steps one by one we'll obtain an optimal set at which applying norm is enough to prevent a critical transition or an extinction in the network. I'll now show you some interesting results that we have obtained. In this figure, you first see that the first row shows you a critical transition in 4 of these networks when the mortality rate for this plant pollinator network increases. The second row shows the application of social norm at all the nodes is able to prevent the collapse as well as it increases the density of the pollinators. In the third row, we see the application of this optimal conservation strategy whereby applying norm only at 72 for the first instance, 56% for the second, 52 for the third instance, and 64% for the last network, we are able to prevent a critical transition in each of these networks. So by now you are hopefully convinced that the optimal conservation strategy is able to prevent a community collapse in each of the four constructed networks that we take into account. Now that it is able to prevent a community collapse in each of these networks of a fixed dimension and connectance, we will further investigate how it behaves and how this numbers will change when we change the system parameters, the norm parameters, or when we apply to some real networks, and in presence of noise, in comparison to other strategies. All these aspects need to be taken care of before we say that the optimal conservation strategy is actually optimal and is a good alternative to mitigate critical transition in plant pollinator networks. Here is the first step to prove the robustness of OCS, where we compare it with other strategies that we can apply. So in the previous slide, you observed that by applying norm only at percentages 72, 56, 52 and 64 for each of this network, we were able to prevent a community collapse. But now when you apply norm for each of this network at the same percentage of nodes of the generalist or the specialist, you see that you still undergo a critical transition in most of the instances, and they are not in general true. So we see here that in comparison to any other strategy, the optimal conservation strategy derived using our algorithm takes the upper hand, is superior, and prevents a community collapse. While this is interesting, we come to the next robustness check, where we apply norm at different networks generated for nestedness in the range 0 to 0.8 across an ensemble of networks that we have generated following the same algorithm I mentioned earlier. So we'll see how this numbers change when we change the competition strength, the interaction strength, and the trade-offs. As you know that as competition increases or as the interaction strength goes down, the critical transition will occur more early and will be more devastating. So here we see that the optimal sets also show similar results, where we see that as you increase competition or decrease the interaction strength, the cardinality of the optimal set increases. However, in most of the instances, you see that it is non-trivial and less than the total number of nodes. So we here again see the practicality of the optimal conservation algorithm. However, there's one interesting phenomena that we observe, that networks of intermediate nestedness are always at a better position in terms of the number of nodes that you require for preventing a community collapse. We next again check the robustness against system parameters and how they behave for change in the system parameters, and we see that when we apply norm at all the nodes in the first row or norm at optimal conservation strategy, the boundaries coincide, showing that whenever you're able to prevent a community collapse by providing norm at all the nodes, you're also able to prevent a community collapse by applying norm at the optimal conservation set. Next, I show the performance on some real plant pollinator networks. Here, I have explicitly shown the architecture of 3 real networks from the Web of Life, and that all the three undergo critical transition, as you can see in the second row. In the third row, we have applied the optimal conservation strategy and show that it is enough to prevent a community collapse. On the right, we here show the application of optimal conservation strategy to prevent community collapse in all the 148 real plant pollinator networks from the web of life. And you see that in almost all the instances, you are able to prevent community collapse by applying norm at less than the total number of nodes. While this is much more scattered because the dimensions, connectance, and all other properties are varying and nothing is fixed, yet we see that our optimal conservation strategy works. These are a set of conclusions from my talk, and the main takeaway message from my talk would be to always think of the human aspect whenever modeling systems which are affected by anthropogenic activities, and also taking into account network structural attributes that could provide more focused mitigation strategies. Thank you for hearing me out.